Good morning, everybody, and those of you online. Welcome to this week's forum at All Saints Church. I am Sally Howard. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm serving as acting rector this summer. But my usual role here is working as part of the Beloved Community Circle and finding all the ways that we can connect and ground ourselves in love and presence of God and each other. And today we are, this is Alfredo Ferragrino and Thomas Diaz, and they will introduce themselves as well when they speak. But we are talking about one of our key values, our core values as a community and as a church, which is joyful spirituality. Maybe I'll take this off a little bit here. Joyful spirituality. And, this again, one of four values, I think is so important and needed also in this time where there is so much, challenge beyond our personal lives. Our personal lives all have challenges, but we are living in a time that is distressing and where rights are threatened and there is an increase of violence. And I think part of what we hope to share together and talk about today is how do we access joy in the midst of difficulty? And so that's what we'll be talking about today. I love a quote by Father Greg Boyle, in which he said, there are times when our stories about God can get too small, too narrow. And I think that happens to us most often when we are afraid. Our images and our ideas of God can get small. And today we're going to talk about, and he talks about something he calls a touchstone image of God that helps us ground ourselves in that reality of God's presence that goes beyond all of the storms and the waves on the surface of our lives and world, into that deep love that not even death can separate us from. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I am now going to hand this over to Thomas Diaz.
All right. Well, good. I think we're still in the morning. Yes, we have about 20 more minutes. So good to have you all with us this morning. Thomas Diaz, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Director of Connection and Care. I first want to start off by first recognizing just how awesome of a value that we get to say here at All Saints Church, that we have joyful spirituality. And I say that because, you can pretty much assure that if you are in a religious or spiritual space, you're going to get a form of spirituality in your life. I think that's kind of evident when you walk into these spaces. But there's something very unique about what we're trying to do with this particular value of adding joy. And I think, it's really audacious that we're even adding joy, because that means we're going to be committed to looking at the perspectives of life, the earth, even the universe. And I think this past week, we've seen the universe in a way that even the scientists could not have observed it in a way, and that's changing the narrative of what our existence is all about. And when we add joy into spirituality, that means we have to also shift the narrative of how spirit lives in us, right? And as people of faith, we also hang on to what we call an image of God. And I think we're also kind of being lifted and processing the amazing word in preaching this morning that really touched on the image of God. But part of joyful spirituality that I have been kind of meditating on this past week is, how do I see the image of God, and how much am I willing to give it permission to evolve as my story evolves? And that's almost a discipline. There's a concept that I like that I've originally first kind of got interested in and wanting to know more, and that was through a Buddhist concept of cultivation. And it's a particular discipline within the school of thought that you can't just say that you know compassion or you know what it means to become awake. You have to cultivate those perspectives in one's life. And I think for us as people who are following a lover and revolutionary way of Jesus, we also have to cultivate that as well. And it does come down to what the church often uses, which is the image of God. So I'm going to read a few passages from this amazing book that I was introduced by Alfredo this past week, called Radical Amazement by Judy Cantino. And so this is going to be like almost an exercise. I'm going to kind of read these passages, and I'm thinking, because of the size and in terms of the audience in the room, instead of going into pairs, I'm just going to kind of go around with the mic and have you respond to a question that I will pose to the group. But so let me first start off. Maybe this is kind of like a preface to the question. So it goes: as you sit in the sunlight for just a few moments, gathering into the light of yourself, considering the fact that you have come from actual light. And now the question: how does knowing more about light, how integral it is in our life, bring you awareness about God? How do you imagine God differently? What changes? What remains the same? What do you want to affirm about your relationship with God, with the divine? So just take a moment to really consider, what is that image that you hold? What is it that you want to affirm in that image? And what part of it are you willing to maybe start shaping or changing that image? And what does that look like for you? And if you are willing and moved by the Spirit, share with us what's in your heart, and just raise your hand and I'll come over with the mic.
Hi, Thomas. I find those questions so very rich, and I'm taking the mic first to give others more time to think. Those are very heady questions. When I think about light, the particles, the new photographs that have come out, I think that we're all part of God. We're all part of the light, and we're all part of matter. And another part of your question, another question that you posed was, I think during COVID, for me, the blessing, the gift that COVID gave was it made my dimensions and experience of what God was so much larger. So Jesus is the one I follow. Those are the roots of my faith. But the branches are just so broad right now that it goes beyond Abrahamic tradition. And that's the gift of COVID, to be embracing of all that's good and positive and of the light.
Thank you, Risa. Yeah.
everybody. I just wanted to share that the first thing that came to my mind is that I, too, am a part of the light. And I also, at this point in my life, I need to move forward and spread my light and joy to others as well and be of service. That's it.
Thank you.
I like this yellow.
It's funny. I thought also of the images that we are seeing, and not just about light, but the infinity and vastness of. You can't hear me even though I talk like this. Okay. Anyway, the vastness of the universe, and also thinking about how endless our love can be to each other. Like imagining that as being the connection. So, I really love this reading because it's so pertinent to what we're experiencing today. And so, thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful sharing. Anyone else? Yes.
Thank you. I really appreciated that exercise as well. When thinking about God as light, I thought about how the light has always existed before me and will after me, and just thinking about that then God has always loved me. Always since before and after I exist and during my existence, really regardless of what I've done, and that the sun shines on everyone, regardless. And so there was just that sense of that presence of God, and I really appreciated that. And coming from a patriarchal God tradition, it's always nice to step away from that, and I think this is helpful for that. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
So, because I'm a big nerd, the first thing I thought of when you talked about God as light is in high school physics, when I learned that light is both a wave and a particle, and that it's like not many things it's both at the same time. Like God can be many things, even things that don't often go together or can be contradictory. And I mean, maybe a little bit less joyful, but I'm still recovering from a sunburn from like a week and a half ago. So light is powerful and can be dangerous. And it's maybe not the most joyful thought, but it is what I'm thinking, so I'm sharing it.
Light is powerful. Yes. Yes.
Hello, everybody. What I first thought about, I meditate a lot, every day actually, and I meditate on joyful spirituality. So when you were talking about light, the first thing that popped in my head was let your light so shine, because we are that light. And I mean, God is light. God directs and guides and supports, like all these unseen forces that we have, to me, are God. They're universal. And the light, if we tune into the light, which is, I mean, God's light is our light. So if we tune into that light within, that's where, let me speak for me, that's where I then go out into the world. Because transforming my inner self, my light, then I can transform, like my personal reality, then I can transform outer reality. And I really believe that we can all do that. I think that our light, if we let our light so shine no matter what, because it was God-given, I really believe that if we all do that we actually can transform the world. So lightness is beauty to me. Lightness is joy to me. Light is it's like eminent. It's wisdom. It's all of that to me. And the only thing for me or for us is to tune into that, because it's always there. And for me, tuning into that is always present moment awareness. and getting deeper into that awareness and that awakening. So.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. And let me come sit down first, I suppose. And on this particular segment, just a line. Divine light at no time has ever been separated from you. You do not stand outside of the creation of light, but you are the very light and life that dwells within you. And I think everyone just hit the mark in sharing exactly that. So thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Could I add an image, Thomas, that,
Please.
the
Yeah.
pictures, I can't remember the name, but it was the Star Nursery. There's a Star Nursery, and there's all this swirling and, various dimensions of luminosity, but out of that swirling and turbulence, and our stars are birthed, and that was a powerful image, I think, for me. It's not random, but in all of that turbulence, there's still light, and there's more light being born.
Yeah, I kind of realized like my voice. Yeah, I think the popcorns are more popular than ourselves here anyway. And yeah, I realized that one of the things that the first words that God uses in Genesis is "let it be light." Is the first one that appears in Genesis, "let it be light." But what's interesting, like within that, it's interesting how this is only one example that the image that we have for God. But at the same time, I do believe that God is a mystery, right? And it's beyond all definitions. The definition that we'll use is the definition how we're going to relate with God. It's very important. So like everybody has different definitions, and it comes from your experience, right? So sometimes we believe that God is a God of truth, is our mother or father, or brother, etc. One of the things I would like to say is that one of the things that in the Gospels, they ask Jesus, the disciples ask Jesus, teach us how to pray, right? And going to the spirituality is, we have to define spirituality later, but when the disciples ask Jesus, teach us how to pray, the first thing that Jesus tells them is when you pray, say, our Father who art in heaven. So the definition for Jesus, the image that he has for God was Abba, was a father, right? So and as we move forward, we depends on experiences, we will have different definitions, and how we define God is how we're going to relate with God, and it will define our spirituality at the same time. So yeah, and our definitions, like we hear in the sermon today, are expanding and are changing. So I wonder if the definition that you have for God when you were little is different than the definition that you have right now, right? And the definition is like I think we cannot contain God in our language and define God in our language. So our definitions continue to be expanding. It's expanding. And it had to do with how we relate to each other, right? Sorry, it had to relate to each other. And at the same time, I do believe that our knowledge for God comes from revelation as well, right? And God reveals through scriptures, through prayer, to meditation, in nature. So it's how we can be able to acknowledge and understand the concept of God. So, Anything else?
Yeah, I'm just curious, Alfredo, when you said the image that you had of God when you were little or a child, versus what your image of God might be now. And I wondered, I certainly resonate with that. I think, I think my image of God as a child really was of a old, white man. I do think that was my image of God. And even though, in my church tradition, there wasn't really a picture of God, certainly, there was a picture of Jesus, and Jesus was white, right? So I think that my image, I internalized, I think, that image of God as male and white. And I think in my background also that, that God the Father was an angry God, and a vindictive God, who you better not step on his toes, so to speak, and be sure that you use the right name for him and believed, the right things about him. And I think about our images and our stories of God, and I will mention a little later how that changed maybe, and would love to hear also your images and how those have changed. But as a bivocational person, both a therapist and a priest, I think a lot about, attachment and attachment patterns as human beings. And, we are all born, with a deep, healthy need for attachment and for secure attachment, right? And secure, babies are born like little meaning makers already. I mean, like they're putting things together even before they're born, right? So we form these little mini stories out of our even, but in a secure relatedness, infant and throughout, childhood has a kind of sense that, that there's somebody there who understands them well enough and meets their needs. So, if I cry, someone picks me up and they try to figure out what's going on, and they, right? And those day-to-day, sometimes minute-by-minute interactions, we begin to form stories that tell us about, who we are and who other people are in relationship to us, right? Secure babies and kids feel that they kind of make sense, and people get them more or less, not perfect, but more or less, they, and that they can, again, expect that they can rely on others when they need to, right? And a paradox, I'll just mention a paradox in development, is that the more children feel that there is a reliable person that cares and loves them they can depend upon, actually the more independent they become. So that's, kind of, anyway, but if we think about that and secure attachment, I began to think about my story again as a child of a God who was angry enough and upset enough, right, to require the death, a brutal death of his son in order to be, to tolerate me, so to speak, right? That was the story about God. It really is not a secure attachment pattern. In fact, we know in development that if children have a parent that they love and need, who they are also afraid of. And that could be because the parent is abusive, or the parent might be have a substance abuse problem, or a mental health problem and an illness that they are scary, that the children, those kids, can't really go forward, and they can't really go back because they need the parent. You can even see it if you watch kids, and it's called a disorganized attachment, because they literally can't go close and they can't go away because they also need the parent. And, I think that some of our traditional stories about God actually induce disorganized attachment, because the fact is, if you have God, father, mother, whatever, who could send either you or somebody else, some other human being, into eternal torture, you are not safe. And you might be afraid, you might feel you need to, but it's hard to love a God that we are also afraid of, right? And I think for me personally, part of that change of a different story, it's partly I had an unusual grandmother who was kind of like, Pshaw, she used to say about that other stuff about God being punitive and so on and so forth. But, really wasn't until I landed here, I think, at All Saints, and began to really hear a narrative that not only is God not a white man, white male, but also that God is a God who could not bear to stand apart from us, but in our suffering, but instead joined us, right? That not that God, Christ came to, save us from God's wrath, but that God came because God could not stand it, to be a part when we were suffering, and would do for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. That's a long, long story, but I think, those, and for me, that transformation really was being in a community that experienced and talked about God in a different way, or female images, or Jesus himself referring to himself as a hen with chicks, and a God who raises us up, and some of the imagery in the Hebrew scriptures of a God who loves us, lifts us up cheek to cheek. Yeah.
This is something, it's interesting. And the whole idea for us to tell you about, start exploring the images of God. I have an article I share, and there was an experiment or exercise that was performed by a lot of people, and they organized, this is a psychological study, and they organized a concept map in which they ask the same question, right? What is God for you? What is the image that you have for you? And people divided, they divide the images based in two, basically anthropological and mystical. So mostly people use human roles for God, right? Like a regulating, ruler, creator, or a powerful one, like a loving, giving, holy, benevolent, inspirational, mysterious, vengeful. So it's like, and based on that, I mean, as I said at the beginning, is the image that you have for God is how you're going to relate to God, right? And going back to the definition of spirituality as well, I mean, there is no one definition of spirituality either. It's the popcorn, maybe. So And for us, it's like when we talk about joyful spirituality, we don't have just one definition of spirituality, as we don't have one definition of God, right? But one of the definitions that I like is the experience and understanding of the divinity. So your spirituality is going to be how do you experience and understand God. That make sense? So you believe in a God vengeful, your spirituality will be related to that, right? Or you believe in a love-giving God, your spirituality will be related to the image that you have for that God. Yeah.
I also think it's fitting that we're here talking about joyful spirituality in an era where I think we just need to be real for a moment, and that is the church is reckoning with itself. And I was going to almost say herself, but you know what? The thing is, I don't want to say that because it has never, as we heard this morning, she has always been present. It's just that we keep cutting her off. And I think joyful spirituality is more than just, well, of course, it's a value here at All Saints Church, but I just think so far with our conversation this morning, we're recognizing that this really is a movement as well. Because it's not just happening here, though this is, I think, Mike Kimmin has often said that this can also be, All Saints can be a launching pad, which I agree with that. And I think that's probably going to happen with joyful spirituality. But this is also happening throughout what I sense, through all of religious and spiritual identity, that we're recognizing, I think, just as a human race, that if we don't tap into it, we know what happens, and it's called destruction. And I love how Brene Brown says that when we are not willing to be vulnerable and have courage for ourselves and for each other, we get sick. We get sick. And so there's also a remedy that comes with joyful spirituality because it becomes almost a protective factor from the things that I think often want to harm us, and yet we can combat it with a sense of how we use that light, right, and that image, and the way that in which we gravitate towards a more secure attachment with the presence of God, which to me is still a very much new concept that I started off here at All Saints, wanting to know more about, and I just love how sometimes the Spirit works. She knows what we're doing here. And if you are part of Richard Warr's daily emails, this came in last night, and when I saw it, I saw this right before I shut my eyes to sleep, and I thought, I know what you're doing here, so I have to share it. It goes, people who know God well, mystic, hermits, those who risk everything to find God, always meet a lover, not a dictator. God is never found as an abusive father. God is always a lover greater than we dare to hope for. Let me say that one more time. God is always greater than we dare to hope for. How different from an account manager. I love that. Most people seem to worship. God is the lover who receives and forgives everything. And I think, and that's why I feel it's a movement, because we can't necessarily, in some ways, think that we know it all enough to say, this is what joyful spirituality is. No, as I mentioned earlier, we got to cultivate that into our lives, and as a community, and most importantly, as a church, which is part of beloved community. And so, I hope that as we continue on, this is the part for me, what excites me about joyful spirituality. It's because this does give permission to really have agency in how you want to shape and form the divine that dwells within you. It's why we say God dwells in you. We mean it. It's just not some superficial line and we're like, this is how we start off to pray. No, we want to actually ground our being by saying before we even utter a prayer or anything we do, we must start what dwells within us. And so I just thought about this right now. I'm thinking when we say God dwells in you, we actually are bringing out that image that we hold within ourselves. And as we do it as a community, we get to magnify all of that image into one place, which I think is really neat. Yeah.
Could I say just kind of riffing on that, Thomas, but a couple more things that, we know from human development about our stories and the images that we have of ourselves and other people and God, right? That no matter what your experience is as a child, right? And the models of attachment, whether it's secure or insecure, that we develop, that telling our story, new experience, telling our story, our whole story, the good, the bad, the ugly, the in-between, to someone who listens, who is empathic and honest with us, values us, that no matter what model of attachment you have as a person, it can change. It is the most plastic part of the brain. And our stories and our story, that can happen telling personal stories, that can happen telling our whole story as a church or a nation, right? And it can also happen in experience with God and new stories, new understandings, of God. The other thing that's really amazing about human beings is that when that story is told, there are strong indications. Again, no matter what a person's experience, how horrible it was, how awful it was as a child, that it alters the attachment patterns going forward. So it is the strongest predictor, being able to tell the whole story of your life is the most powerful predictor. They can tell at 6 months pregnancy. They can predict with reliability what kind of attachment pattern that parent will have with a baby at 1 year of old. And when we change those internal stories, it stops intergenerational violence. And that is, that's just kind of developmental research that, backs up, our work towards dismantling white supremacy, right? That dismantling these toxic, harmful stories or images of God so that we can heal and be our full presence, but also that we can stop intergenerational patterns of violence. And we can do that with God's help, with Spirit's help, right? With each other, we can do that. And, just maybe one more comment about images, mercy in the Old Testament. I grew up with the idea that mercy was, again, like God kind of like holding God's nose, like, okay, I guess if I must, right? Meaning that I grew up in a tradition that taught that human beings were born bad, really. original sin, Calvinism. I don't know if there's any of you Presbyterians out there. Some good Presbyterians too. But mercy, and mercy actually means fierce, bonding love. That is what hesed means, fierce, bonding love. And the Almighty, God Almighty, in Hebrew, one of the meanings of that is breasted God. So anyway, as we do this work of dismantling, telling our whole stories and dismantling white supremacy and patriarchy in these images, there are incredible resources for us, to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting ways to say. I think, like I said at the beginning, like our images are changing and our definitions are changing, and it's an ongoing and evolving relationship with God. Is evolving. I mean, everything is changing, and our stories have to be changed too. I remember when I was little, I just coming from a Roman Catholic background, is that the old catechism that tells you there's a hell and you're going to go to hell and et cetera, et cetera. But as my definition is moving, is evolving, I believe in a God that is love. And even if the hell exists, which I don't believe, God will rescue you from that hell. And that's a quote from the Lutheran presiding bishop. So even if the hell exists, God's going to rescue you there. So that definition comes with experience, right? To start, so you have to live those experiences, and it comes from your spirituality as well, and you have to do your work as well. I mean, I say like God reveals yourself. God reveals God's self in you, and you have to do your homework as well, right? Somebody mentioned here that do meditation. Thomas Keating said like the silence is the language of God. Silence is the language of God, right? So the moment that you allow God to be with you, everything changes, and your definition changes. So, and going back to the same, going back for spirituality at the same time for me is to be in relationship with God, with your community, and yourself. It's about relationship, right? And that relationship, you foster that relationship as well. And then how do you find joy as well, right? I do believe that sometimes when you find joy is by gratitude. One of the prayers I often do is the examen for Ignacio de Loyola. The first step for the prayer is gratitude. So you say, what are you grateful for? And I believe, in my experience, when you are grateful, you find joy. You cannot complain, right? If you complain, you don't find joy, but when you're grateful, you find joy. And at the same time, this is a spiritual practice, right? In which God, you define God, you relate to God in the definition that is more related to you. I made my story of God, as Sally say, I have my story been changing and evolving, right? But but I find joy by being grateful. Yeah, when I'm not grateful, I'm not joyful. I know.
So we have just a few minutes left. You guys, what thoughts have stirred up for you as we've been talking, or questions you might have? Yeah, thanks.
I was thinking about God, and I was just listening to Alfredo, and I was thinking, or Reverend, I should call you Reverend Alfredo. And I was just thinking about, I grew up Catholic too, from, probably a zygote, because they went every Sunday. and probably more than that, because they needed it. My family needs to go to church, and they all still go, except the next generation. But my point is, and they're much healthier. But my point is that I think I had anxiety and fear of God because the way they did church in the Catholic Church, when you're like, knee-high to a grasshopper, until you hit that year when you're going to make your first communion, was like, I was freaked. I didn't want to be alone in my bedroom. I was like this lucky little girl who had her own space and all her toys and all that. And I'm like, how come my brothers get to be in a room together? I thought God was so mean. Why would he take his only son and put him on a cross and his mother's holding him? I mean, I'm like 2-3 years old and I'm looking at the La Pieta and I'm going, what is this God thing and why are we here?
Right.
And I couldn't understand. And then I made my first communion. And our pastor has been one of the leaders in LGBTQ rights, helped people during the AIDS crisis in the Catholic Church. This man, he played with puppets and spoke to us as children like we were like mini adults. And he told us about Jesus' love. And I will tell you, my anxiety level went from like this to like, oh, you mean that's who God is? That's who Jesus is? Oh, praise God.
Yeah.
And it was around the time that I was X'd out of the Catholic faith, because if you don't get married and you don't have kids and some of your friends are gay, they don't really want to hear about that. And so I couldn't do that. So after Newman Center, which is the Catholic club for, it's more liberal for when you're in college, I found the Episcopal Church. And I thought, I still am struggling. But in community, I could keep hearing what I'd heard when I was in like 2nd grade and 3rd grade from this wonderful pastor that we had for a few years. And I thought, that's what I'm hearing now in the Episcopal Church. And I just saw that as a light. And lately I'm seeing that possibility in the Catholic Church because we've got Pope Francis and he's got a vision, and I'm a lot more calm about the whole thing. I'm actually pretty happy to be going to church.
That's
and I
great.
really missed being here with you guys.
Yeah.
And it's like, to be here, I feel like mentally more stable in community with people who see God as that love and light.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you
so
so
much.
much,
Yeah.
Megan. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yes. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Quetzal, pronouns he, him. It's weird for me to hear you talk about joy in a time when it seems like we're in this churn of political terror, anger, things. So I just want to know, how does everyone deal with finding joy in the anger, in the struggle, in the political fight? Like, how do you connect those things?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. Does anybody from the audience want to talk about that?
I mean, I think, so Thomas said something about cultivating joy, and that brought the image of like a plant growing in this ground, right? So for one thing, like that fig tree thing that Jesus said, you got to cover it in shit first. Like, that's literally, that's in the gospel. Cover it in manure. So like the shit is part of the cultivation, and the process of a plant growing, it changes over time, it grows, it morphs, it doesn't always look the same, and it has different parts to it. I think the anger is part of that, because the anger is a recognition that things aren't how they ought to be, right? And that's connected to the joy that we feel when things are as they ought to be, when we do feel that community and that connection. And the anger is a healthy, natural response, as is like grief. I mean, I as a person who struggles with anxiety and depression, like I kind of get a little defensive sometimes about like, oh, we all need to be happy, we all need to be, but like that's not the same thing, right? You can be like, Mary Magdalene is weeping when she hears Jesus call her name, right? The grief is part of the joy. Like the grief comes from the deep relationship she had with Jesus this fear she has of having lost him, this inability to care for his body in the way that her culture and her like demands of her. She's grieving and upset, and in that comes this joy of learning of the resurrection. So I think, to me, joyful spirituality can encompass grief and anger and hurt and sadness. I think what it can't really encompass is what Sally was talking about before, which is a fearful spirituality in which you are intimidated or afraid of this maniacal, abusive God where you need to walk on glass all the time because if you don't, then, you know, the world will end or whatever. Like, so that's my perspective for what it's worth.
Well said.
Yeah, I say right away. For me, I mean, joy is not like you have to be smiling. I mean, it's, for me, more joy is about find your peaceful center. It's about, I mean, it's like we can define, as we define God, as we define spirituality. I think it's joyful. I mean, joy to be joyful is have to be, you have your own definition. But for me, it's a choice in a way. I can choose to be sad and anger, or I can choose to be in peace, you know, and I can choose to act in anger, or I can choose to act in love. And I just remember the Gospels, you know, Jesus' time was really horrible time, you know, was living in the occupation, discrimination, they crucify everybody there, right and left, you know, and Jesus up to share love, and that's for me is joyful, you know, even in a situation in the Palestine of the first century was really bad. I mean all, you can talk about all the abuses that people receiving in occupation land. So then Jesus decided to say, no, I want to love the enemies, love, and that love, when you love, you find joy and peace, you know. But it's a choice, I believe. You have to make your choice. So.
Yeah. I would say, or just add into that, maybe one other thing, you know, about Jesus is Jesus was a Jewish mystic, right? And as we've said many times, he was not white, he was not Christian, he was a Jew. And he was a mystic. And I do believe, because I'm a developmentalist, you know, that's my bias, but I do think that, you know, we absolutely have to know and feel that we are loved. And it's not, you know, it loved in real honesty, right? So we can say, you know, this isn't right, because it isn't. There's a lot that's not right, right? Or and God, I don't think God is ever, someone said to me once, God has big shoulders. I don't think God, it might have been Zelda said that. Zelda said, it was Zelda. God has big shoulders, right? There's not anything that alienates us, right? So I think, in addition, that would just be my way of thinking about it, I guess, also. And maybe that's just very personal to me, but I think that sense of being without condition, totally loved and prized and valued. You know, that God is, I think Greg Boyle also said once, God is too busy smiling at us, too busy keeping her eyes on us of love, to be focused on all of our faults and disappointments. And it doesn't mean we don't tell our whole story, right? Anyway, I know we need to stop. Thomas, do you want to say anything before we stop?
I just want to thank you for spending your mid-morning, now early afternoon, to tap into some joyful spirituality, and know that this is just, you know, really just the beginning of what we have hoped to continue on this conversation, and it will continue on. And please reach out to us if you want to continue on and really in exploring with joyful spirituality. Me personally, this excites me because we need it. And God is present, and we know it. So thank you. I do a prayer, if I can end it. Yeah? Okay. So I end this in prayer, and then just enjoy the rest of your beautiful Sunday afternoon. God dwells in you. God of light, we give thanks that you have asked us to be bearers of your light, sparks of your very self, making love tangible. Forgive the ways in which we try to invade being who we are, but the times we resist your invitation out of the false that fear has more power than your love. As we become flames of your love, may we recognize that we are not separate from you. Because of your will, we are participants in this divine light. And now, may we build up this field of love that will help transform the world. Amen. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.